This is going to be a fairly detailed look at the remodeling of this small bathroom from start to finish. A lot of this stuff is going to be chucked, some of it will be saved. That ring, that towel bar, probably won't reuse them, but they're new enough, I'm not going to trash them. That sink and that faucet are fairly new. The cabinet isn't new, but it's in good enough shape I can repaint it. But look at that tub. That tub's got to go. And that light's got to go. But I'm going to tie into it, and I'm going to add a light above the shower, a little LED can light. You can see how dark it is in there. Nobody wants to take a shower in the dark. Come on. Also, that ceiling is what they call acoustic texture, which is, most people call it popcorn. Not delicious. It will be scraped, and I will do a knockdown finish up there. Also, that bezel on the fan, I'll take that down and repaint it too, because it looks gross. This hand textured wall, that's all going to get ripped off, except behind this beadboard, because I'm going to do wainscoting there, or wainscoting if you're British, of tile that's going to go with the shower and the floor and everything. Of course, that also has to go behind the toilet, and it's going to get a new floor. So the next thing I want to do is to remove this toilet. And so the first step in doing that is going to be to turn off this valve, to close this valve. And this is a quarter turn valve. Some of them take a bit more work than that. And the next step is just going to be to flush it. So we want to get as much water out of the tank as well as from the bowl. We're going to hold that open and get as much water to fall out of there as possible. That is about it in this case. The next thing is to get as much out of the bowl, and I have a little trick for doing that. I'm going to take this bucket of water, and what's going to happen is by pouring more water in, the water level is going to sink, but since now the valve is turned off and there's no more water coming in, now we have less water to actually pull out of the bowl. The next thing I'm going to do is to use a vacuum to vacuum out the remaining water so I don't make a mess when I pull the toilet out. If you don't have a wet dry vac, you could also just use a sponge in a bucket and soak the water out of the toilet that way. So now that we have the water out of the toilet, we can pull this line off of the valve. You're going to have a little water spill out of the bowl that was just in the line, and a lot of times these old valves will leak a little bit, so you may have to prepare to deal with that. Next, there's two bolts, one on each side of the toilet, and there's a little cover that covers them up. And these nuts are the only physical connector that holds the toilet to the floor. Now this bolt wants to turn underneath, and so my remedy for that is the one on the other side came off fine, and so what I'm going to do is lift up on the toilet and put some pressure on it and then wrench it, and that pressure should help keep that bolt from turning underneath. And there we go. I like to just throw my parts, hardware, my lines inside the tank. They'll be safe there. I'll know how to find them later. Now there's going to be some wax on the bottom of the toilet from the ring that forms a gasket between the toilet and the flange. And so what I do is I like to have a piece of cardboard, and I just pick the toilet up like so, and I set it right on the cardboard. Now half the time when I go to pick this up again, the cardboard will stay stuck to the bottom of the toilet. That isn't the case this time. But that will keep you from spreading that wax all over the house. Now that hole is a gateway to unpleasantness. And so one of the things I like to do as soon as possible is to just jam a cup down in there. That will help cut down on the smell that comes, up from below. And, if you drop anything, that'll keep you from losing it. Now I want to remove this cabinet. There are 4 Phillips screws that hold it in, and this one's not too heavy, so I'm not going to pull off the doors. I'm just going to hold it with one hand and pull those 4 screws out. I'm also going to remove the trim. This one has a small flat blade screw on the bottom that locks it in place, and then a plate underneath. I'm going to put these pieces back together so that I don't lose my parts. Now it's the exact same process for this towel bar. You don't have to remove these screws all the way, just enough so that they'll come loose. Now this mirror is going to be the next thing to go, and you can see it doesn't have any fasteners on it. It's glued in place, and I'm going to end up trimming this caulking or whatever this is off of the edge of the mirror, like so. Now to get this off, I'm going to drive wedges behind it, which is easier said than done. It takes a lot of patience because you don't want the mirror to spring out and bite you. So it's not that I'm saving this mirror for anything, it's just that I don't want to deal with a broken glass. I'm just using some regular door shims here, and little by little the mirror should separate from the wall. You hear that? Some of it at least is broken loose. Now these shims up above have lost their tension. It's because something is coming loose up here. The more even pressure I can put behind this thing, the safer I am, the less tweaking of the glass I can do, the better. Okay, a bunch of it's just let loose. Now I'm just going to work my way around it. Not going to get in any hurry. There it is. It's loose. Gorgeous wallpaper, right? Let's pull this light fixture next. I'm going to turn it off and give the bulbs a chance to cool. And then I'm also going to find the circuit that this is on, because just because you've turned the light switch off doesn't necessarily mean that there's not hot wires behind this. I like to have a temporary light, and that will just hang from these wires, but it'll give me some lighting without dragging out work light, especially in a room this small where there's not a lot of floor space anyway. It's good to have something that you can turn on and do basic tasks from. Another thing to notice while I'm here is that there's no box. There's just a big hole in the wall. We'll fix that when we do our drywall work. We'll put an electrical box in the way it's supposed to be. Another thing to notice is that even though the lights are disabled in this room now, the outlet is not. It is on a separate circuit. So another thing I want to do is to pull all the trim off. I'm going to pull this chair rail, the beadboard, and all the other trim in this room, including the casing that's on the door. I'm going to run a knife along the top, because this trim is going to have some caulking, and I need to detach it. Then a flat bar is my tool of choice in this case. No reason to get in a big rush. Now I'm not planning to reuse any of this trim, except maybe the casing around the door. Of course, behind that beadboard, we'll see some more of that lovely, lovely wallpaper. One place I can pry without doing a whole lot of damage to this casing is behind the hinge. Whatever damage I might do, I won't be able to see. To remove this side splash, it's going to be a similar process to removing the mirror, in that it's glued in place and it's flat and it's just delicate enough to break. So we're going to drive door shims in behind it. Just slowly separating it from the drywall. And so, again, by applying even pressure throughout, we're not prying from one end, which would break it in half every time. If you listen, you can hear, even when I'm not touching it, you can hear it creaking and releasing itself from the drywall. I'm going to cut this shim, maybe a couple more shims down, so that I get into the thicker part of the shim. I can do a little more wedging. All right. We're loose from the wall, but there's also a little caulk down here, so I'm going to carefully, without scratching sink top, cut through that silicone. Okay, that's free. Now I'm also going to have to disconnect the plumbing. So there's a drain off the center of the bowl, and there's two feed lines feeding the faucet. Again, we're going to shut off these valves, and these are quarter turn valves. And then using our 5/8 line, we'll loosen that up. Now I went ahead and opened the faucets up above so that there won't be as much pressure in these feed lines. It's going to drip some water. There's nothing we can do about that. If we needed to protect the finish of this floor, we might put down some towels or maybe have a sponge ready or a cup or something to catch that water. But for no more water than that is, I'll just mop that up later with a sponge. Now this trap is going to have some standing water in it also. And when you have a hairball in your sink, this is where it sits, if it's going to sit. It'll either be clogged up by the stopper or it'll be sitting in this trap. And so one way to clear a faucet is to pull this off. Now this is going to be full from here to here, water. So I'm going to be careful with this, and I'm going to carry it and dump it into one of my water buckets. So I'm finally about ready to pull this drywall, but before I do, I want to come with a plan. I know I don't need to replace the bottom half because we're going to lay tile on it, and this drywall here is in good enough condition for that. Now, a sheet of drywall is 48 inches wide, but it's 60 and a half inches to the bottom of this texture. So I don't want to just put a 1-foot piece in there. I'd rather put at least an 18-inch piece in there. So I'm going to measure down right? So there's 18 inches at 66, right? So that's 4 foot 18 inches. But I'm going to pull 2 inches off of the top edge of the top sheet, and I'll show you why in a little bit. So that leaves me at 64 inches. That's where I want to make this cut. So I'll make a mark here. I have a 4-foot level with me, so I'll make another mark within 4 feet of that mark. And then one more here at the edge. There's also a flange on the edge of this fiberglass tub that goes behind the drywall. And so I'll have to cut a strip out all the way down. Of course, this will all be gone, but I'll have to cut a strip out all the way down in order to access the screws on that flange so that I can pull the shower out. I'm going to go ahead and remove the drywall here that was behind the toilet because I don't really want to stick tile to the wallpaper. I don't want to try to remove all the wallpaper, and I want to be able to access my plumbing. I also want to make a cut all the way around where the wall meets the ceiling to separate that paper joint so that when I pull the wall off it doesn't tear into the ceiling, because this drywall, dust bunny, this drywall is not going to come off. We're just going to scrape it. Now it's finally the part where I'm actually going to start removing big pieces. You're going to be tempted to just beat it all to bits and have a huge mess on your hands and wreck the whole rest of the house. But it's better to just do whatever it takes to get a grip on it. I'm going to start over here with my claw hammer and just kind of make myself a handle. And then the rest, for the most part, I'll just pull out my hand. The bigger pieces I can pull off, the fewer trips I have to make out to the trailer, and the less of a mess it's going to make. Now when you have this stuff pulled off, you'll find all these nails that are holding it off. They either have to be removed or they have to be driven in flush. So now that I have the drywall removed, the next project is going to be removing this tub and shower. This will not fit through the door. This was installed when the house was new and there was no drywall on yet. And so what they would do is leave a stud or two out, install the unit, and then put the studs where they belong before the sheetrock is installed. Now, we're going to have to cut it into pieces to get it out of here. But first, I need to remove these pieces of trim. I'm going to remove the shower head and this neck. I'm going to remove the trim around the valve, the spigot that fills the tub. I'm going to remove the cover off of this overflow, and I'm going to remove the frame of that drain. One thing worth mentioning is whoever installed this unit did do one thing right. They put this block in, but what they didn't do right about that is that it's flush with the studs. This needs to be back just a little bit so that this doesn't protrude and so that this doesn't protrude past the drywall, or in this case it's going to be concrete board. Most of these pieces just unscrew like so. There's an O-ring that seals inside of here and the threads are back here so that this piece can be sweated on and the plumbing can be cut off after it's sweated. Since this valve isn't going to be reused, I don't have to be too careful in removing that cap. Behind it is one Phillips screw. And holding this bezel on is two more. Now we don't want to disassemble any of this. If we go too far, we'll have a water disaster of cartoon-like proportions. Now this is a special tool designed to fit inside this drain frame and unscrew it. If you don't have one, you could try jamming some screwdrivers in and and twisting them, or a pair of pliers, chances are the center of that will break if you try to do that. And once you've done that, then you'll have to cut into this and drive it with a screwdriver or a chisel and hammer. Now this is going to take some time to do. It's effectively glued to the tub with plumber's putty, and so even though you can move it, there's a lot of resistance. There it is. I'm going to cut this unit into 4 pieces: the back wall, a front and rear wall, and the tub itself. And so I'm going to cut all the way around the top of the tub and down each inside corner. A couple of things to be mindful of: you don't obviously want to cut into your plumbing, so be careful of that. You don't want to compromise the structural integrity of any of your studs. You also don't want to do any damage to the face of your insulation. Now, there's a number of tools that would cut through this. This is just a thin layer, maybe a 1/4 inch or less of fiberglass. But I like to use something that isn't going to make real fine dust, because it's incredibly bad for you to breathe and really messy. So for me, my choice is a reciprocating saw like this, and a fairly toothy blade. We're not looking for a fine cut here. We're just looking to separate the unit into pieces. Now, removing a tile floor, there's no two ways about it. It is not fun. But if you can get one started, the rest of them will get easier. Now that I have all those tiles removed, I also have to remove this layer of thin set mortar. That's when things really start to get dusty. Now, one thing to notice is that this insulation is not stapled, and the reason it ends up that way is because I talked about those units going in before drywall. Well, they also usually go in before insulation. So unless you have someone on the crew that's mindful enough to insulate this one wall before that unit goes in, it's going to have to be insulated after the fact. And the only way to do that is to jam it down with a stick or something. Luckily, these were pre-cut and they're already the right length. But I'm going to go ahead and go through and staple these. But our demolition, our tear out, is done. I just have one more messy task before I call it a day, and that's going to be to scrape the popcorn off that ceiling. I'll show you what that looks like. I have to remove this register, and I also have to remove this bezel that covers up our fan. To remove the bezel, super easy. There's just a couple of springs, and you reach up in there and pinch them. That's it. And we're going to refinish that before we reinstall it. This just takes a couple of screws. Now, what a lot of people do to scrape this popcorn is to soak it down with warm water and then use the widest blade they can get their hands on to scrape it. And that's not wrong, but in my experience, that just gives you a lot of extra work. And so you're better off with a smaller blade. This is a 6-inch. This is a 4-inch. But the bottom line is just keep it flat. And it's okay that it's a little lumpy because we're going to put a new texture on here anyway. But when you scrape this, when you scrape them wet, you expose all the joints, and the joints need another coat of mud after that. But when you do it this way, your surface is closer to being ready already. It saves you a couple steps. The other thing about scraping it wet is that only works if the ceiling has never been painted. Now there's a few nails that have popped. I'll replace those with screws. If you ask me, drywall nails should be in a museum and otherwise be outlawed. However, screws can also make these pops in the ceiling. They're just quite a bit less likely. I will have to repair that. I may have to do a little repair here and there, but for the most part, it's ready for texture. And that's a much quicker job than scraping it all the way down to the paper and then refinishing that second or third coat of mud on the whole ceiling. Now there's a couple of different ways to staple this insulation in. What a lot of drywall guys will want you to do is to push it back and staple it to the side of the stud. But you'll get a better vapor barrier if you staple it to the face of the stud. Now the drywall guys won't like this because it's harder for them to find the studs, but to them I say, oh well. Well, that's it for the tear out. Next we have some rough-in work to do. We've got a little bit of rough-in plumbing, a little rough-in electrical, and we'll be ready to start putting this place back together. Thanks for watching.